On a Friday night, it all started. My wife of 8 years, Stephanie, and I received an invitation to her best friend Alice's birthday celebration. Since college, Alice and Stephanie had been close, and over the years, we had gone to dozens of Alice's house parties. This one didn't feel any different. Stephanie looked gorgeous in her blue dress as we prepared. Her hair was styled flawlessly, and it fit her figure perfectly. She asked how I looked. As lovely as ever, I grinned. Alice laughed. I think you could take the limelight away from her. It's about her tonight, so don't be dumb. It was about 8 o'clock when we got to Alice's house. There were a lot of people there, both familiar and unfamiliar. Alice was holding a drink when she greeted us at the door. She gave Stephanie a tight hug and said, "Ben, Stephanie, I'm so happy you made it." With music blaring and laughter reverberating throughout the rooms, the party was lively. For a while, Stephanie and I stayed together while hanging out with some friends. In order to relax, we even had a couple drinks. It was then that I saw him. He was tall. He stood across the room with a whiskey glass in his hand, his eyes focused on Stephanie, his shoulders broad, and a smug smile on his face. I'm not sure if it was the alcohol or my intuition, but there was something unsettling about the way he gazed at her. I nudged Stephanie and asked, "Who's that guy?" And she followed my eyes. "Oh, that's just Alice's friend Ryan Hek," she said nonchalantly. "Last year, I believe I met him at her housewarming." Ryan lifted his glass a little toward us. Back then, Stephanie gave a courteous smile. She looked at me. "Avoid being strange." She laughed and said, "Ben, Hune isn't dangerous." "No harm," I muttered to myself. Yes, of course. I made an effort to ignore the sensation, telling myself that I was merely being overly suspicious. I let him go because Stephanie wasn't paying much attention to him. She laughed and chatted with a few of her friends. After a while, I lost sight of her in the crowd, but I remained close. I quickly looked around the room, not wanting to overthink it, but I couldn't find her. Alice was occupied conversing with a group of guests close to the dining area when I made the decision to ask her, "Hey, Alice." Trying to sound informal, I asked, "Have you seen Stephanie?" Alice paused to reflect. She was on her way to the kitchen when I last saw her. She ought to be present. "Thank you," I said. I was walking toward the kitchen when I turned the corner and came to a halt. Stephanie was standing next to Ryan at the counter. Ryan was leaning in slightly too much as they conversed, their heads pressed together. With her drink in one hand and her necklace lightly touched in the other, Stephanie was laughing at something he said. I walked directly toward them, my fists clenched. "Stephanie," I said, sounding sharper than I meant to. They both turned to face me. Stephanie said, her smile wavering a little, "Hey Ben, what is going on?" I glared at Ryan and said, "Mind if I interrupt?" Ryan put up his hands in a protective manner. "No issue, dude. We were merely conversing." I turned my attention to Stephanie and ignored him. "Can we have a conversation?" After hesitating, she nodded, "Sure." We strolled back to the living room after she put down her drink. We were surrounded by music and conversation, but I was only thinking about her. "Why were you with him in there?" I inquired in a quiet voice. She frowned and said, "We were just talking." "The big deal." "What's the big deal?" I said, attempting to remain composed. "The way he was leaning in, he was all over you." "Stephanie, it didn't seem like a simple conversation." She folded her arms. "You're going overboard. I told you that Ben is Alice's friend. All we were doing was talking." I gave a frustrated shake of my head. "The way he looks at you bothers me. It's disrespectful to our marriage and to me." Stephanie's face softened as she sighed. "If it bothered you, I apologize. However, I assure you that nothing is happening. Could we just unwind and enjoy the celebration?" The expression in her eyes made me temporarily back down, even though I wanted to push harder. "All right," I said. "But don't bother him." She gave a nod. "All right." The discomfort in my chest persisted even after we resumed our socializing. I made an effort to concentrate on other discussions and even managed to chuckle at a couple of jokes. Things appeared to be back to normal for a while. After an hour or so, I was engrossed in a lengthy discussion with a coworker who was also present at the celebration. In order to get another drink, Stephanie excused herself. As time went on, I became aware that she had not returned. I looked around the room but couldn't find her. I went into the kitchen to see if she was talking to Alice, but I couldn't find her. I then looked in the dining room, the patio, and even the tiny den, where some people were playing cards, but Stephanie was nowhere to be found. A peculiar uneasiness descended upon me. As I moved away from the crowd, the sound of laughter and muffled voices diminished as I began to make my way down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The corridor was eerily silent, and all the doors were shut. I paused at the first door and pressed my ear against it, but there was no movement or sound. Every time I strained to hear anything, the rooms were silent, so I went to the next door. I went past the restroom on my way to the final door. I stopped. Through the heavy wooden door, I could hear faint voices. I pressed closer, trying to make out the words, and my heartbeat quickened. After a few seconds, I recognized the voice as that of a woman who was laughing and talking, but it wasn't Stephanie. I went to the final door, relieved but still uneasy. I stood there with my heart thumping in my chest. First, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard Stephanie laughing, clearly and softly. My stomach churned, and the laughter ceased, to be replaced by a different sound. Faint whispers, followed by the distinct sound of moans. My hand hovered over the door. I felt as though the ground beneath me was collapsing, knob quivering as a tempest of anger and heartache swept through me. I inhaled deeply before opening the door, and everything fell apart. My wife was lying on the bed with Ryan, entangled in the sheets. His shirt was unbuttoned, and her dress was off. First, they didn't even notice me. Unable to comprehend what I was witnessing, I stood motionless. Stephanie, her head jerked toward me, and her eyes widened in surprise as I spoke, barely raising my voice above a whisper. "God forbid. Ben, this isn't safe." My voice shook with rage as I spoke. I saw enough. Ryan leaned back against the headboard, looking totally unconcerned. "It's not what it looks like, man. Calm down." I gave a sour laugh. "Not what it appears to be. Really? Is that your best option?" With tears running down her cheeks, Stephanie hurried to cover herself with the sheet. "Ben, allow me to clarify." My chest felt like it was about to burst, so I shook my head and hurried out of the room. How could she have hurt me and us like this? She trailed me down the corridor. "Ben, please stop being so barefoot and unkempt. I made a mistake. I was not thinking about it, so I said, oh, so now it's the alcohol's fault." As I turned to face her, "When you smiled at him across the room, you were thinking perfectly. Don't act as though this just occurred." She flinched. "I didn't mean to. I love you, Ben, for this to occur." I yelled, "Love me? Stephanie, you don't degrade someone you love in this way. You don't betray them." The disturbance was beginning to be noticed by the partygoers. Alice came over to us with a worried expression. I said icily, "What's going on?" "To your friend. She has a lot to explain." Sobbing, Stephanie buried her face in her hands. Alice glanced at Stephanie and then back at me. In an attempt to defuse the situation, she said Ben allowed them to speak in private. I grabbed my coat and said, "I'm done talking. Enjoy the remainder of your gathering." I went outside and climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. Hours passed while I drove incoherently in an attempt to comprehend what had just transpired. I kept seeing pictures of Stephanie and Ryan, each one more vivid than the last. I was experiencing an uncontrollable storm of emotions that included anger, guilt, and pain. I didn't know the answers, but I knew I had to figure things out. After everything that had just transpired, I had no desire to return home. I drove for what seemed like an eternity in an attempt to get away from her because I couldn't face her yet. The ideas racing through my mind, and I looked at the screen as my phone buzzed. Stephanie was the one. I chose to ignore it. I wasn't prepared for her to speak. Over and over, she called. My stomach twisted even more when I saw her name on the screen. I couldn't speak to her in this manner. I finally made it to Damien's house. When everything fell apart, he was one of the few people I knew I could rely on. At almost 2 in the morning, I knocked on his door. "What the devil, Ben? It's late." As he opened the door, Damon said in a groggy voice, "I apologize for being here so late, man, but there's an emergency." I told him in a shaky voice that I knew I needed to talk to someone but didn't know how to explain it. Damon moved to make room for me. With trembling hands, I took a seat on the couch as we entered the living room. Damon sat across from me and gave me a worried look. In an attempt to regain my composure before speaking, I inhaled deeply. "She betrayed me. I saw her with him. Damien," I said, my voice hardly more than a whisper. "Ryan in a bedroom. I caught sight of them together. Indeed, they were." I kept thinking about how close they were, and I was unable to finish the sentence. Damon remained silent for a while, shock and disbelief visible on his face. "I'm not able to believe it, man." I gave a nod. "They were visible to me. I'm at a loss for what to do. I am unable to return home. Right now, I can't even look at her. I'll simply head to a hotel." I stopped, feeling like I was being crushed by everything. I have lost all sense of reality. After allowing me to calm down for a while, Damon finally spoke at a hotel. "Have you gone insane? You don't have to be by yourself right now. You can stay here tonight." "Are you certain?" Still trying to make sense of everything, I asked. "Yes," he said firmly. "You won't be leaving." With gratitude, I nodded. "Many thanks, dude." I tried to gather my thoughts by sitting back and stroking my hair, but my phone kept buzzing while I was trying to relax. When I took it out, Stephanie was calling once more. I couldn't bring myself to respond, but my fingers lingered over the screen. I saw the call end up in voicemail. Then, right away, there was another call. "Damon saw that ever since you left, she has been phoning." Oh, I didn't answer. I was unable to. As the calls continued to come in, I simply watched the screen. They were all like reminders of the betrayal. The silence was broken by Damon's voice. "What are you going to do now, in your opinion?" I exhaled deeply, my chest heaving. "I'm going to get a divorce." Even though I was still having doubts about everything, my words felt final as I finally made up my mind. Damon gave a nod. "I am aware of a good attorney. If you need his number, I can provide it to you." "Excellent, many thanks, dude. Thank you so much." I spoke in a quiet but earnest tone. I returned to the house by car the following morning. I couldn't stay away from it forever. When I entered the front door, I knew it would be difficult to get the few items I needed. Mostly clothes. Stephanie's eyes were red from crying as she sat on the couch. When she saw me, she got up. "We need to talk, Ben," she said in a tremulous voice. I didn't immediately respond. Instead, I simply brushed her aside and went to the bedroom upstairs. I picked up my jacket, some pants, and a couple of shirts. Her gaze was following me, and I could feel it. Standing in the doorway, she said, "Ben, I didn't mean for this to happen. We can resolve this, please. You must realize that it was an error." With my hands still clutching the clothing in my arms, I turned to her. "This is how you see it, a mistake." "Stephanie," I asked in a firm but low voice. Unable to respond, she averted her gaze. Even though I could see the guilt in her eyes, nothing changed. My chest constricted as I remembered that moment. "I saw you with him. I can't stop thinking about that picture. I can't stay here, you know. I'm gonna file for divorce." Her face turned pale. "Please, Ben, I'm so sorry. Give me another chance. I'll do everything in my power to put things right." With a heavy heart, I shook my head. "No, it's too late." I gathered my remaining belongings and left without turning around. I knew there was no going back once I got into the car. I knew I could no longer live a lie, but I had no idea what lay ahead. The divorce took only a few months to complete. Stephanie called me a couple more times, but I didn't answer. I had to get over this. Damon supported me when I needed it and guided me through the process. Eventually, everything calmed down. Even though the pain persisted, I learned to cope with it as I concentrated on starting over. I didn't feel bad about walking away. Although it wasn't simple, there was no other option. I appreciate you watching.